There are 3 items on tonight's first reading agenda. The first is a presentation and discussion regarding the ongoing water rate study. There is no action requested of the council tonight, but just maybe an opportunity to ask questions of David Hyder, our consultant who's been working on this project. The time for action will be later in the fall when, based on the discussion tonight, we will present an ordinance recommending water rate changes. But we wanted to have David come back one more time, walk us through the preliminary report and his preliminary recommendations. So he's here this evening.
Good evening, Mr. Hyder. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Mayor, Council, good to be back for the, I guess, third and final installment of rates. Tonight I just do want to go over the kind of a big picture overview of what we've gone over so far and our recommendations. In terms of first off, I want to talk about the rate requirements. What does it cost to operate the water system? How does that compare to the revenues that you're currently generating and anticipate to generate going forward? I want to talk about the rate structure alternatives that we've considered this to date in terms of how we may collect those revenues from your customers. And finally, I want to talk about our recommendations that we've come up with. So first off, in terms of the rate requirement overview, if you remember that the total cost of operating the water system, what we term the revenue requirements, consist of really 4 building blocks. The first building block being the operating and maintenance expenses. Day-to-day operations of the system includes your purchased water from DuPage Water Commission, which accounts for roughly 50% of your operating costs. In addition to that, we have planned capital improvements, reinvestments in the system, repairs, maintenance, things of that sort. We have outstanding debt. You currently have one debt issue which will be paid off by 2012, which is related to your AMR system. And finally, contributions to reserves. It's good to set aside reserves in case of for working capital as well as for repair and replacement of the system. The total of that is your annual revenue requirements. If we compare that to what you're currently bringing in revenues, we get a sense for what the picture looks like cash flow wise. The green line on the chart here is your anticipated revenues from your current rates. If we don't change rates at all, what we think your revenues will be, you'll see that there's a shortfall between revenues and the expected expenses going forward. What our plan and recommendation is in terms of how to adjust for this shortfall and to get revenues more in line with expenses is to essentially increase rates. We're proposing at 14% a year for the next 3 years, followed by a 10% and a 9%. There's significant increases, but they are required. You're running about $1 million deficit in this current year. So the next question we looked at was how are we going to recover those costs? So we looked at several different rate alternatives. First alternative is essentially let's just keep the current rate structure, which is alternative A. Just update it as we showed on the previous slide by 14% to generate the additional revenue we would need. The other alternatives we considered were alternative B. Alternative B would impose a fixed charge based on meter size. The larger your meter size, the higher your fixed charge would be. And in addition to that, we'd have a unit rate for the volume of water that you use, similar to how you are currently charging your customers. Alternative C is the biggest departure from your current rate structure. Again, we would impose a fixed charge based on meter size. But then we would have a multiple class inclining block rate structure, which would essentially be put in place to encourage conservation. The more water you use, once you go through these blocks, the more expensive it would become for that water. We've set it up so that each of those alternatives would produce the same amount of revenue. Alternatives B and C would both produce about 14% of your revenue in the fixed charge. So you'd have 14% guaranteed revenue. Currently, under the current structure, you have about 7.5% of your revenue is fixed. So in terms of our recommendations, regarding the rate structure, we are recommending the alternative B rate structure, that it should be implemented for 2011. We're recommending it because it accomplishes a number of objectives that we set out for the study. Number one was we want to generate more revenue. It will generate 14% more revenue to help meet expenses. It will increase the revenue stability within the water fund. Currently, you're getting 7.5% of your revenue regardless of how people use water. Really, about 60% of your costs in providing water are fixed. So it would give us a more stable revenue stream. The benefit of charging the fixed charge based on meter size is that it increases the equity among customers. If you have a 10-inch meter, you can demand a lot more water on the system. Therefore, we need to have a lot more storage in the system to serve that customer. So those fixed costs of maintaining the system and keeping that storage are equitably spread out among the customers when you use a fixed charge based upon meter size. And lastly, alternative B really has the smallest, minimizes the impact upon the customer, particularly in comparison to alternative D. While it is a significant change to go to the fixed charge based on meter size, alternative C is such a dramatic change with the different customer classes, the inclining block rates. I think it's too much of a change at this point in time. Additionally, I know one of the considerations, particularly within the strategic plan for the village, is to encourage conservation. And I would argue that rates is one component of that, but you are essentially seeing conservation currently. We're projecting that you're going to have about a 1% decline in consumption over the projection period. Your rain barrel program, things of that, are encouraging conservation, so you are effectively doing that to some degree. So we feel comfortable with recommending B. What the actual what the actual rates would look like under alternative B. You can see what the fixed charges are by meter size. Majority of your customers, the vast majority of your customers, are 5/8-inch meters, residential. They would pay $8.25 per bi-monthly period, and then depending upon your meter size, you would pay a greater fixed charge associated with that meter. I've shown 3 years here because I'm going to talk about a potential phased approach, but you can see over the next 3 years, increasing the revenues by 14% a year, what the rates would be. If we come on down in the chart, you'd see that the variable charge would be $3.30 for inside village customers per 100 cubic feet of usage, and the outside village charge would be $3.80. Again, this would produce about 14% of your revenues in the fixed charge. That would stay steady throughout the period with the rates we're demonstrating. One of the concerns that we have with this rate structure, based on discussions with staff, is that if you're a really small user, if you use very little water, you potentially would see a fairly sizable increase percentage-wise in your bill. Currently, you pay $6.62 when you use 200 cubic feet or less. Under this alternative, you would pay the $8.27, and then you'd have to pay the $3.30 for each 100 cubic feet you use. So that would have a fairly large impact upon a small user. So as an alternative to that, we came up with a potential phase-in, which would really lessen the burden in terms of the fixed charge and what that would do to the small customer. You would arrive at the same point over 3 years. The rates shown in this chart are the same as the ones on the previous for 2013. It's just that we would phase in that increase in the fixed charge. As a result, you can see at the bottom that you would get 9.5% of your revenues from the fixed charge, going up to 11.5 and then 14 to arrive at the same point. To compensate, to make sure we generate the same amount of revenue, though, we do need to increase the usage charge. So rather than $3.30, it would be $3.50 and $4 instead of $3.80. But ultimately, in 2013, you end up at the same place. So that is an option for the council to consider as a phase-in of our recommendation. I wanted to show what I was alluding to earlier in terms of the impact upon the customer. Again, a very small user, it's in my opinion, very difficult to use this little water in a 2-month period. But a very small user, somebody using 5 CCF, 100 cubic feet, would currently pay $17 per bi-monthly period. Under alternative B, if we don't phase it, they would pay $25. If we do phase it, they would pay $23. So it's an $8 increase or a $6 increase. When you work that out, it's about a 13-cent per day increase over a year. It's not a very, dollars-wise, it's not very much, but percentage-wise, it is a significant increase. Okay. In terms of an average customer in the village throughout the year, when you average out the annual usage, uses about 1,500 cubic feet per bi-monthly period. Their current bill would be $50. It would go up to $58. And because of the usage and the fixed charge, it works out to be about the same under the phased approach. So an $8 increase a little bit more under the phased. And last, residential customer, if you're a high water user using 40 CCF, which would be a lot of water for a residential customer, you can see what would happen under the current bill, $132 per bi-monthly period, $140 under alternative B, not phased, and then if we phase it, it's actually a little bit higher because of the usage being at $3.50 instead of $3.30. Okay. Wanted to demonstrate the same thing on the commercial. This is a commercial bill. The average commercial customer has about a 1.5-inch meter. They use about 100 cubic feet per bi-monthly period. You can see what their bill would be under the current rates, 2010 rates, what it would be under alternative B, not phased, and then if we do phase it. And then lastly, for sample bills, an industrial customer or a school, most of your schools have about 2-inch meters and use about 200 CCF per bi-monthly period. See what their current bill is, $662, and what it would be under each of the alternatives. So that's it in terms of rates. I'd be glad to take any questions after we wrap up, but a couple other recommendations. We were also tasked with looking at all of the other miscellaneous fees and charges that you impose when you provide water service. Most of them are appropriate and set at the appropriate level. I did want to talk about some of the more significant charges, which we term capital fees. There's three types of capital fees. The first fee, and these are fees that are charged when somebody joins the system, when you have a new customer, when somebody upsizes their service, things of that sort. But the first fee here is a tap fee. It's a fee that the village currently imposes. It's to recoup the cost of labor and materials when you tap the water main for a new connection. You can see it's imposed based upon line size. The current tap fees for 1 inch are $200. Working with the staff, looking at the actual costs of materials and labor, those are understating. The current fees aren't fully recovering the cost of providing that service. In 2011, we would recommend going to the fees shown here. And we would recommend that you potentially consider adjusting these fees annually, tying them to CPI or inflation, because these costs do continue to go up. It's a nice way to have it just automatically go up. Another capital charge is a meter charge. These are charges that you impose for the physical meter as well as the installation of the meter when it's a new customer. You currently charge them for 5/8, 3/4, all the way up to 2-inch meters. You can see that the 5/8 and 3/4 are pretty close to the current costs, but when you get up to the bigger size meters, you're really dramatically undercharging for what it costs to provide these meters. So this is the actual cost of providing a 6-inch meter, is $6,200, and primarily that's the actual cost of the meter. Rather expensive. And again, these costs do go up annually. We would propose that you consider inflating them on an annual basis. Okay. And the last fee is the capacity fee. And you currently charge essentially two components of a capacity fee. The distinction, or the reason for the distinction, isn't necessarily clear, but you currently charge a connection fee and a capacity fee. And what these fees are essentially designed to do is to recoup the cost of building capacity in the system. So if you have a customer come along and they're a 6-inch customer and they have a 6-inch line, you've already built that capacity to serve them. You've made significant investments in the system. And therefore, it's very common, and as you do currently, you charge to recoup some of that cost of building that capacity. We would recommend that you combine those two, since there's not a rational or a explainable reason as to why there's two separate fees at this point. It's very common in the industry to call them capacity fees. You can see what we've calculated. We calculated what a 1-inch capacity fee would be, and then the American Water Works Association says that based upon the size of the line, there's a factor that shows how much potential demand each of these customers can place on the system, and it's typical to scale them up based upon those factors. Now, as you can see, for a line that is 4-inch or larger, the difference between what's currently charged and the actual cost of providing that capacity is very significant. For this reason, and this is very common to do, we would recommend that the village handle each of these on a case-by-case basis at the discretion of the Public Works Director or somebody else within the village. primarily because of the additional considerations that may come into place. That may be for economic development reasons, other reasons that when you have a customer of this size come into the village, you would want to look at this on a case-by-case basis rather than just necessarily implement these fees. And with that, the essential next steps would be, based upon the feedback that we receive, we will finalize the draft report that we've submitted. And then this fall, I believe an ordinance will be provided, at which time you'd be asked to make a decision in terms of the rates. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, David. Would you remind us, I didn't see it in here, but I know it was in either your second or maybe your first or both reports, the assumption your firm made with respect to the increases anticipated at the DuPage Water Commission?
Yeah, we're assuming 10% a year.
Okay.
Increase in purchased water.
10% over?
Every year.
For ad infinitum, or, I mean, the 3-year time horizon?
We have a 10-year model. We're
Okay.
projecting here 5 years, but we are assuming that every single year for a 10-year period that they would go up. And if you do that, it becomes, I think, close to 70% of your operating costs become just purchased water.
They are in the midst of trying to recalibrate their cost
Correct.
formula for charging the municipality members of the DuPage Water Commission their costs. And what they're talking tentatively about is a 25% increase.
Right.
Does that cause you to alter, or do you think the course you've set with the recommended fee arrangement covers those type of increases adequately?
I would be comfortable with what we've recommended. However, if there's 5 years of 25%, then we haven't set it up appropriately. But I do think that 10% a year for the 10 years is being fairly conservative, because I'm hoping that the corrections that they're making aren't going to be every single year. I think they're trying to
they're trying to catch up real quick
Right.
with that sales tax subsidy that's going to go away
Right.
in the not too distant future. So they're trying to, I think, reprice water at the real expense.
Yeah, correct.
Okay. Any audience members have any questions or comments with respect to the proposed water rate study and the recommendations of our consultant? Can you just slide over real quick, David? Good evening, Mr.
Good evening,
Mr.
everybody.
McCray.
Tom McCren, 545 Chicago Avenue. I just want to praise them for I read the study completely through. I don't think I've ever seen anything as thorough as that. I just have one little comment, which is kind of an aside thing, having been a technical writer for 35 years or so myself. You should have somebody edit it. I realize it's an early go-around. You probably did a spell check, but there's some significant syntax errors in it, and to have a proper editor
We got
look it over
syntax errors
to make
verbally thrown out here all the time.
Right, but no, that would make it the other thing I would ask is, this is a pretty significant impact on the users.
Oh,
Can we
yeah.
have a public meeting or something once things are?
What do you think? Yeah, I mean, Tom, we put it on the Hometown Times.
I know, but this is
Put it on the website. We could knock on every door in town
Right.
and try and jam it down
Yeah,
people's
but you
throats.
probably have the same
but
people show up for the public meeting, but, yeah, do everything you can,
We're trying.
and then some, to get it out so that the people understand this and what goes on, because, and it's reasonably easy to understand what's going on from their proposals, because I think they're couched in terms that the average person can, if this, then that. And I have one other question, perhaps it's staff or somebody, is why do we need so many different meter sizes? Seems to
Well, that's a
me.
good question. I think it's a capacity issue.
And that I'll defer to Nan or Stan at our Public Works Department.
That's a good move. Well, someone jump up. You can't defer to someone else.
Stan Balicki, Assistant Director of Public Works. The different meter sizes really are a function of the fixtures that are in that building that is being served. So the greater the number of fixtures that are there, whether it's bathrooms, showers, kitchens, things like that, there are calculations in the industry that are out there that basically gauge what that potential demand could be at any given time the meter has to be sized appropriately to be able to measure that water flow properly as it's coming into the building, as well as to provide enough water when it's needed. So there has to be a variation in those sizes.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you. Got it covered, Tom?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to Tom's point, one of the reasons for the separation between the preliminary recommendation and as an actual vote is to get the word out that the village is considering something of this magnitude and change. So we'll broadcast that in all venues.
Including the water bill that we often use as a device for getting information out to all
Yes,
residents?
that would be the logical way to communicate about a water potential change in rate.
Right. Other comments or questions from audience members with respect to the third installment of the water rate study and the recommendations made by our consultant with respect to rate structures going forward? Once, twice, thrice. Council comments, questions? Commissioner Barnett, you look all ready to jump out of your chair.
I'm not jumping as quick as Commissioner Newstadt's seconds, but this is, as Mr. LeCrun said, this is a fantastic study. It's really well written, and I appreciate that. I can't underscore enough for the folks that are watching and listening to this meeting to take the time to read it. It is an easy read. It is, but it's really important to us. There are a couple of elements here. First, there's the obvious maintenance of a safe and reliable and predictable water service, which is what we're trying to achieve. But it also, there's an awful lot of parallels to other village services that I think one would do well to consider in light of reading this report. Elements of trying to manage fixed costs, elements of predictable revenues downstream, elements of known increases that are coming. These same subjects speak to an awful lot of what your village does for you. We provide a list of services, but all those services, much like the water, have fixed elements and variable elements and ever-increasing costs. And so we're about to start this the budget process anew, and there's a lot of philosophical elements in here that I think I find very appealing, and I'd encourage all our residents to read through. I had a couple of specific questions about the report itself and some future information for us prior to actually deciding a path here. It looked to me like in the balance of the report, much of the sort of the back end was spreadsheets of sorts.
Yep.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's a financial model.
All right. So are those ultimately available to our staff to what if till their heart's content?
Yep, they are,
Okay.
and they have it. I know Judy's used it to look compared to the budget and make sure we're in line.
Sure.
Yep.
As the mayor indicated, the water commission is a variable. So are some of those elements about future consumption.
Yep.
And it'd be good for us, I think, as a council maybe to see, because I think it's as easy as changing a couple numbers and rerunning it, to see what happens if it's 15% increase or 2% decrease in use or 1.5 or some of that effect, what it does to rates.
Yep, correct.
Any thoughts on why it seems our commercial customers change so much seasonally? I know it's a little off the wall, but the obvious thing for residential users is pretty obvious. It's grass watering and car washing. But it would strike me that a lot of our commercial customers are process driven for water consumption. Is that not the case?
Not knowing, to be honest, I don't know in terms of the demographic. I guess the correct term would be, we were given, here's your commercial customers, here's their account numbers, I don't know the village as well as potentially I should in terms of the names. But you're definitely not an industrial city where you have this baseline of consumption that you're
Sure.
Cranking out cars, and it's not uncommon when you're a largely residential that the residential in nature services would mimic the seasonal trends that people are going to be out more to dinner and things of that sort when the weather's nice and during the summer and things of that sort. That would be my assumption.
So do we think, and don't have to answer this right now, or staff too, that because we're lumping in churches, schools, universities, et cetera, in that commercial accounts, that their behavior will, through the next 10, 15 years, mimic residential usages? I'd like to know that, if we expect any difference in the commercial usage.
Just to follow up, we do have the data by individual customer, by class. We did lump it together for purposes of this, but we could easily provide in a table, here's how much churches are using all that.
Okay. The 14%, is there Is that driven purely by industry standard, what you think we can stomach for the moment? We talked about the, right now, the water itself is around 50%. With a 10% increase every year, it's going to be like 70. We talked about 60% of the cost being fixed. It still seems like we're on the short end. There's probably is a limit to what people can bear, but those fixed costs are still fixed costs. And so if we know we're going to have reduced consumption rates and we know we're going to have increased costs on the variable side, limiting ourselves to 14% seems dangerous and a little bit unpredictable. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and probably didn't go in. I did go into a fair amount of detail in the study talking about how we came up with the 60%, what we think is fixed versus variable. And it's a combination of, okay, let's make sure we cover administrative expenses, let's make sure we cover customer service, let's make sure we cover meter maintenance and things of that sort. And then getting to a point where, because of the impact on the small customer, regardless of how much water they use, what it would do, percentage-wise, it's a very significant percentage-wise increase, and that's often how it's presented to the public. That it's $8, but to them it's 100 and some percent, which sounds horrible, but it's it's a couple cups of coffee. It's not really that significant in terms of dollar-wise. So it's that balance. To be honest, we considered getting to 14% an achievement, and thinking going beyond that might be too difficult in terms of a push. But the model set up that we essentially do have the ability to go into it, and over time the village could increase that percentage if they wanted to. Within the industry, 10 to 20% is the norm.
Okay.
And the flip side, the contrasting argument there is that we're encouraging people to use less water.
Right.
And the higher we make that fixed charge, the less incentive there is to conserve.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to say it's an exact science, but it's a combination of both.
Okay. Well, it is undoubtedly something that we should look outside of ourselves for guidance on. We found all sorts of reasons that we need outside input on this. The only comment about ABC that I have, and kind of following up on that, is that the idea of conservation is one that I think we should really pursue to the greatest extent possible, even if we know that the impact on that is higher fixed cost coverage requirements down the road. Whether it be some of the elements up here that other commissioners have brought up about energy conservation and things, just the general concept that we want to pursue and encourage conservation is one that we not only have talked about as a group, but we hear from our residents all the time. We heard about it with the garbage. A lot of rhetoric swirling around that, but one constant was it seemed everybody was looking for ways to reduce, reuse, recycle, the whole mantra. And so I'd encourage us all up here, my colleagues, to really think through how much encouragement we can stomach, because that's what it sounds like it boils down to. There's certainly some built into all the alternatives when you're paying for water, but that's one that I think we should be pretty aggressive with. Last thing is that the tap connection fees, the ancillary fees. I'd like some sort of, if we can get it, market kind of information. I mean, it's one thing to cover our costs, it's another to find out what it costs to tap in other places. You talked about the effect on economic development. Certainly there's the redevelopment effect, but if I don't, even if we're covering our costs, I don't know that I want to be the lowest guy on the block all the time. And so
You're consistent.
Does that surprise you?
well, yeah, I'm probably not surprising anybody, but what we found and what we've heard in here is that we're not covering it. We're not covering it right now. We're not even covering basically the cost of the meter almost. And we know we've got major fund issues, and so looking for every opportunity to fund that thing is pretty important. And I see no value personally in always being as cheap as possible if the market will bear something else. We're not leading the market in this stuff. So, what do we think for timing on the final deal here? We said later in the year. Is that a pre-budget, post-budget, in the middle
Oh,
of
it's
it?
got to be in the budget.
It's, actually, these recommendations, the 14% increase, are reflected in the proposed budget.
Okay.
And we would like to have that discussion and decision concurrently with the budget so that we could have the rate changes ready for 2011.
Fantastic. Okay, that's all I have for now. I'll probably dream something else up, but thank you.
Thank you.
Just a real quick follow-up on Bob's point. The fixed charge, the goal will be between 10 and 20%, and the recommendation here is 14. We're at 7 right now?
Yeah, a little over 7.
A little over 7, okay. So even though this may not suit everyone's ideal rate, it's doubling and recapturing significant fixed charges that we're leaving on the table right now.
Correct.
Okay. And lastly, just as a point of contrast with Commissioner Barnett, I too want to know what the going rate is, but I also want to make sure our friends at the Chamber, Downtown Management, EDC, have a look at that, because I want to make sure we're covering our costs. And I don't necessarily mind being competitive, because when it comes down between us and Lombard, us and Oak Brook, us and Timbuktu, it sure would be nice if we're truing up our expenses on that end. And maybe we are not the low cost, but we're the, it's the true costs. And we're showing our business partners, customers, et cetera, that we're not trying to gouge anyone, but we're passing along real expense associated with infrastructure that's being passed along to all our stakeholders pro-ratably. That's just a thought. Commissioner Beckman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. First of all, as Commissioner Barnett had indicated, I think this is an outstanding presentation and analysis, and I truly appreciate it. It helped me process this information and come to the conclusion that similar type of services that we offer the community, that a fixed rate element does make sense in these kinds of cases, and I truly appreciate that. The one question that I do have, and I don't have the number of questions that Mr. Barnett had, but I do have one question that deals with particularly the recommended capacity fees. Mm-hmm. On the bottom here, you had a footnote that indicates that you recommend capacity fees of 4-inch lines or larger to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. I wholly agree. But I'm curious as to why you chose that certain point at 4 inches. Why not 2 inches or 6 inches or whatever have you?
To be honest, that's kind of the industry standard. If you go around and look at other ordinances, you'll see that they usually publish up to a 2-inch, and then they'll say negotiated or case-by-case basis beyond. I think it's a distinction there between and Stan could address this better than I could, but what type of business could be on a 2-inch versus a 4-inch? There's a magnitude of difference there in terms of the impact and economic development and things of that sort.
So these proposed capacity fees, beyond that point, they're there for illustrative purposes, I presume.
Correct. It essentially would allow you to look and say, well, if we have a 12-inch line or a 10-inch line, according to MFSG's study, this is the true cost of providing that capacity. Mm-hmm. So you have a starting point to work from.
Because in the real world, this falls into this bucket of things that when we're trying to encourage a company to come experience the Downers Grove experience, that we all want to look at and make sure that we're as competitive as possible.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Schnell.
I have a couple of questions. One, it's a great report, and it kind of renews your faith in consultants, because God knows we've had a lot of really bad consultants, and well, we have. And this is truly a great report, and if we had to have a good one, this is the time to have it.
It's always time to have
well, it's always time, yeah. But, and this, well, anyway. It's really nice to get a good report and actually get what we wanted. My concern or fear in all of this is that we have to do a really good job of educating the public as to what's going on and why it's going on. And not only single-family residences, but in particular the hospitals, the schools, people who have budgets set up that may not be aware of a proposed 14% increase in the coming year. This goes into effect on January 1. The school budgets have been already set for that period of time, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we need to do a proactive job of getting the message out so that they are aware of the fact that this is coming. No matter how we structure it, be it A, B, or C, we're looking at a 14% increase. At least that's how I read it. That's a significant increase over what they are paying now, and they need to be aware of that so they can budget accordingly. How we get that message out, I'm sure staff has many ways of doing it. It's just we need to get the message out. In line with that educational component, a lot of condo associations, and I don't know if this is true of all of our condos, have like one central meter, and then they disperse it to people within the condos, and if that's included in their monthly fee. Again, if those monthly fees have already been set for a year, they get hit with a 14% increase. You know, it's not our problem per se, but I think it's our problem that we have to educate people to the fact that this is coming. So to me, that's a really big component of all this, and I know it's not all the village's responsibility, but it's partly our responsibility. We need to get that, you know, information out. And I think, you know, if we can use newspapers to get the message out to individuals so they understand that this is coming, and the report's great. It is a very easy read. So if people would read it, they'll have questions, but again, they can contact staff and get that information out. The question I do have for the consultant is in the actual report itself and not in the information you gave us tonight. You talk about the fact that our reserve policy is 90-day operating, no less than 90-day operating expenses.
Right.
And you talk about changing that or including a 90-day capital project reserve fund. Can you explain why you think that's important?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of confusion there. You currently have a 90-day, basically working capital reserve in the enterprise fund that is tied to operating revenues. It says that we should maintain 90 days of our operating revenues. And I would argue that you should tie that to expenses, because if it's tied to revenues, it's circular in that if you raise rates 100%, then your target balance just went up. If you see what I mean. Essentially, just to tie it to the operating expenses is one recommendation. But then we do have a recommendation for a repair, replacement, and renewal reserve, which is a capital reserve, in addition to the 90 days operating.
Okay, so there'd be two reserve funds.
They'd be two reserve funds. One you already have. We're just saying tweak it a little bit to tie it to operating expenses.
Okay.
The other one is essentially to set aside funds for stuff that you should be doing but you're not doing in terms of repair and replacement.
Okay.
Because what we've looked at is what you should be doing, what you plan on doing in your CIP, and then the delta there, phased in over time, would be if you're not spending enough, here's a reserve that you set aside. Because the fact of the matter is if you have a line blow up, you then have funds there available to repair and replace that line. Over time, not to get too theoretical, but if you build in that reserve and you get the rates up to a point where they're constantly putting aside some funds that allow you to reinvest in the system into the rates, you get essentially a self-sustaining system, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Because the rates are now at a level that they're allowing you to constantly not just do O&M, but also do repair and replacement of the system.
Okay. And as far as whether or not A, B, or C, my gut feeling is either A or B is better. C, I think it's just, as you said, it's kind of a huge variation for what we're doing. My concern is similar to Bob's in that I think we need, because water is a precious commodity, and obviously, you know, it comes out of Lake Michigan, but that spigot could be downturned and we could get less. We're not supposed to, but anything can happen when you're dealing with the city of Chicago. So, you know, I think conservation is extremely important, and whether or not B allows for enough of that conservation, I'm not sure. You know, but I would go with either A or B, but I would like to see some sort of a component in there for conservation. Mm-hmm. And again, I'd like to see it minimizing something that would, over a period of time, allow people to adjust to the increases, as opposed to the really biggie all at one time. Mm-hmm. So, thank you very much. It's a great report.
Thank you.
Commissioner Walden.
Thank you, Mayor. No real question for it was as everybody up here has said, it was a great report, very detailed, and just about everybody on my left up here has hit a lot of the questions I had. I was impressed with, as I was going through the report, I'm looking at all the detail, and you even had, you know, pension numbers and all that kind of stuff in there. And you know, that's a lot of detail. And then I thought, well, you know, when we're getting into that kind of detail, it's important that that our staff, as Commissioner Barnett pointed out, that we have access to that. And I compliment you and your company for allowing access and the ability to go in and plug in the numbers as situations change. Mm-hmm. And I think there's going to be a lot of that between now and when we come to a final decision on what rate structure we're going to take and what the rates are actually going to be and how we're going to proceed. I tend to, I'm kind of leaning towards a B-type situation. It seems to make most sense to me, but I also urge the public to get into this, to look at it, and to weigh in, just as they did on the garbage issue. If they enjoy doing that, they'll really enjoy doing this one. It's and there's a lot more color involved too. But the only other thing is the comment on the capacity fees, the recommendation that the public, I mean, you know, the assumption is that the Public Works Director is going to set the process up, and that's something that staff is going to have to come up with a process that we're comfortable with that'll address the need for whether it's economic development or whatever the situation might be. I think as we get into this and get into the numbers and the details, that we also have that process set up, or a recommendation for that process, so that we can move forward. But thank you so much for the work, and you know, we'll be looking at it. A lot of detail in here. Everybody should look at it, because it's gonna, it's your money, folks. It's your water. It's your money, and it's still all in the water fund. You're still hopefully going to be able to see it go in and go out and understand it. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Neustadt.
Thanks, Mayor. I just have one kind of quick question. Obviously, everybody loves the report. There's no question you'll give you a 6-0 vote on that, probably 7-0 if Commissioner Durkin was here. The recommended tap fees and the meter charges, how many of those are we doing now? What's our experience been with those meter change-outs, not only for residential usage, but for commercial usage? I think that's an interesting number to look at, maybe in the last year and even before then, when things changed in our world, just to see how the recommended tap fees and meter charges might affect why people may want to locate here in Downers Grove. Otherwise, the proposal as it's laid out seems to make sense. I know that DuPage Water Commission is the wild card, but it seems like we've addressed some of the issues that are going on with them. So I look forward to answering some more of these questions, but thank you again. Mr. Hyder did get the Downers Grove experience tonight. I bumped into him at one of our dining establishments, Gatto's downtown. So he did not only spend time working on our rate study, but he spent some time in Downers Grove.
He read his contract. He suspended.
He did a good job of it tonight. Thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you.
Commissioner Beckman.
Yes, thank you. It's one of these things that as you go through this material and we're conversing, I'm saying in the back of my mind, I knew there was another question, and it came to me the moment I passed on the baton. While I fully understand and can concur based on the information I have before me with your recommendation, I'm curious as to what set of circumstances, what situations would have to prevail for, say, you to come back to us and say, I believe that alternative C would be a better methodology for you to deploy at this time.
I would say if conditions changed in terms of water usage, for one, if you saw, you know, water usage, particularly during the summer, continuing to spike, you know, more and more at a level that that is beyond what it is currently, which would, I guess, essentially say that current efforts such as the rain barrels and things like that aren't working as well as they should. To be honest, one of the concerns with alternative C, and I think it's in the recommendation of the report, would be that the village needs to, because we have those 3 classes, those classes were set up a long time ago in terms of commercial, industrial, and residential. And one of the concerns was if we went to that structure, do we have those classifications set up correctly? So we weren't sure that that was 100% in order. So that would be something that we would want to look at. And I think it really would be usage pattern changes if you're continually seeing just demand spiking up and spiking up. You're not in a situation where you're bumping up against capacity issues necessarily. We have a lot of clients that have water treatment plants, and they basically have to spend $20 million when they hit this certain point. And there's a lot of incentive there to really encourage conservation from a cost standpoint, to tell customers, hey, your bills are going to go up astronomically if we have to expand this plant because you keep peaking the system. You're not in that, exact same situation. I realize there may be restrictions, or in the future we don't really know what the allocated water would be. But situations like that where you really have to encourage the conservation, I would argue that when a customer sees an increase in their bill, there's going to be a conservation as a result.
Pretty much an economic law.
Yeah.
There's
So
some price
plant-
elasticity there.
Plan C may be Plan B down the road.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Heider. I'm mindful of Commissioner Schnell's comments and Mr. LaCren's comments. We're going to try and do everything we can to get notice out. This is our third meeting. It may not be the sexiest subject in the world, and it may not draw all kinds of attention, but it's pretty darn important. And I think it's instructive as well with respect to one of the core services this village is required to provide. Maybe it's arguably one of the most basic and most important services we provide. And we're finding out in a very, I think, incremental way that we haven't priced it right, that we're in trouble of being upside down as soon as next year as a village, and that we need to price it right, and it butts against some pretty important concepts and policies like conservation. And when you increase by 14%, I think it's pretty safe to assume there's going to be a decrease in usage, which is a good thing. How much behavior changes based on these changes, we're going to find out. And it may be a continuing adjustment on the fly. We certainly are going to use whatever we agree upon as our baseline, but I don't think that ends anything. We look, and if behavior changes dramatically to the bad or good, we need to adjust, and I think we now have the foundational information that we can make those changes, and I think, as Commissioner Barnett said, based on real experience, we can plug in these numbers and make the necessary adjustments. I do hope, as Commissioner Waldeck said, folks chime in on this. I don't think, however, we're going to get the same type of reaction as we got in the refuge debate. There is no, we are doing volume-based, but what we're finding out right now is that 60% of the freight is whether you turn the faucet on or not. And that infrastructure needs to be paid for, and we're only covering 7.5% or so as is, and that is, frankly, underweight for a village like ours, and frankly, it's an impending financial disaster lest we change it. So I don't think we're going to get the, hey, I want to just pay for what I use. You do, but we got to true up the infrastructure expense and the fixed charge as best we can, as equitably as possible, and then continue with the volume base, understanding that we want to continue to drive environmental best practices, which unfortunately has detrimental effects on our revenues. That's a little quandary. Anyway, there is going to be more to come on this. I'm going to challenge Mr. Fieldman and Mr. Kozlowski to come up with something novel, figure out a way to get information out, whether we e-blast some more, whether we run a continuing insomnia theater of these meetings with respect to water pricing and rates, whether we use the telephone system, whether we raise a flag, a different flag to get everyone's attention. We got to do something, I agree. Invariably, someone's not going to hear it and they're going to be upset, but we're going to try. That's what we should do.
Will do.